That was the sound of my mother's hand across my face. She looked at the uniform I had earned with my blood and said the words that would start a war. "You're a disgrace." She thought she had sentenced me to a life of shame. She didn't realize she was attacking a general, and I was about to plan my counteroffensive. My name is Major General Heidi Bruce, and I stood as a stranger in my own home. The air in the Blackwood family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, was thick with the scent of money and grief. White lilies, funereal and cloyingly sweet, fought a losing battle against the mingled perfumes of the guests. From my position near the grand staircase, I watched the living enact their prescribed rituals of mourning for my father, Colonel Sterling Bruce. Men in dark Armani suits murmured condolences. Women in Chanel dresses dabbed at dry eyes. My own uniform, the Army Service Uniform, Class A, felt like a foreign object in this sea of curated sorrow. Its dark blue fabric was too stark, the row of ribbons on my chest too loud in their silent testimony. I was an unwelcome truth in a house built on beautiful lies. A figure detached from a cluster of mourners and approached me. It was Senator Thompson, an old friend of my father's, his face etched with genuine sadness. He took my hand in both of his. "General Bruce," he said, his voice firm with respect. "Heidi, your father was so proud. This country owes you a great deal." Before I could form a reply, a presence slid smoothly to my side. My mother, Seraphina Blackwood. She placed a hand on the senator's arm, her smile polished to a terrifying sheen. "Oh, Senator, you're far too kind," she cooed, her voice like honey laced with poison. The guests nearby quieted, their attention drawn to the matriarch. Heidi has always been so civic-minded. She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. She just volunteers at her unit, you see. A way to keep her busy. A quiet gasp was audible from someone nearby. The senator's face tightened, but he was a politician, skilled in navigating such social minefields. He simply nodded and retreated. The invisible slap had been delivered. In one perfectly crafted sentence, my mother had reduced 25 years of my service, of my leadership, to a hobby, a meaningless pastime. I stood still, my gloved hands clasped behind my back, in parade rest, my posture the only defense I had. I felt the heat rise in my neck, but my face remained a mask of military impassivity. The moment the senator was out of earshot, my mother's polished smile vanished. Her fingers, strong and cold, clamped around my bicep. "The library, now," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous command. She pulled me from the main foyer into the mahogany-paneled library that had once been my father's sanctuary. My eyes immediately went to the wall above the fireplace. The photograph of me, grinning on graduation day at West Point, was gone. In its place hung a massive, new oil painting of my brother, Julian, looking regal and smug. I had been officially erased. "I told you," she began, her voice shaking, with a rage that was terrifying in its intensity. She let go of my arm. "I told you not to come here in that costume." She turned, her eyes sweeping over my uniform with undisguised disgust. "You shame us, you shame his memory." "This uniform honored him, Mother." My voice was low, steady. A mistake. My composure only fueled her fire. "Honored him?" She laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You are a glorified helper, a glorified clerk, who gets to play soldier. Don't you dare stand in my house and talk about honor." She took a step closer, her face contorted. "You are nothing but an embarrassment, a helper in a uniform. Do you understand me?" And then her hand, still clad in a pristine white glove, swung through the air. The sound was a sharp, dry crack that echoed in the silent, book-lined room. A fire bloomed on my cheek, hot and stinging. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. My gaze flickered past her to the doorway. Julian stood there, swirling a glass of what looked like Macallan 18. He had seen it all. He met my eyes for a fraction of a second, gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug, and turned his attention back to the amber liquid in his glass. That single dismissive gesture was more brutal than the slap itself. It was confirmation. In this house, I was utterly, irrevocably alone. I turned my eyes back to my mother. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling, a look of triumphant cruelty on her face. She thought she had won. She thought she had finally broken me, but she was wrong. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The stinging heat on my cheek cooled and solidified into something hard and unyielding. The pain didn't vanish, it was transmuted. It became fuel. The hurt, the humiliation, the decades of being made to feel small and unworthy. It all coalesced into a single point of cold, crystalline clarity. My training, my entire life as a soldier, took over. I was no longer a daughter being struck by her mother. I was a commander assessing a hostile engagement. I met her gaze, and for the first time, I saw her not as the towering, all-powerful figure of my childhood, but as she truly was. A weak, insecure woman, terrified of anything she couldn't control. My voice, when it came, was not in the room. It was in my head, calm, precise, and absolute. This wasn't a family argument. This was a declaration of war. I analyzed the situation, the assets, the liabilities, the objective. And you have made a grave tactical error, Mother. I looked at her, at the portrait of my brother, at the room from which I had been erased. You just attacked a general in her own home. The battle has begun. The battle had begun. But this war had started long ago. Fought not on foreign soil with guns and artillery, but in the polished hallways and manicured gardens of the Blackwood estate. The sting on my cheek had faded, but it was replaced by a deeper ache, a phantom limb of 1,000 smaller wounds collected over a lifetime. To understand the present, I had to retreat into the past. I had to map the battlefield of my own history. My mind drifted back to the spring I turned 18, the year of 2 celebrations. I remember holding the acceptance letter from the United States Military Academy at West Point. The paper felt heavy in my hand, a tangible weight of a future I had fought for. I showed it to my mother, Serafina, in the sunroom. She was arranging roses in a crystal vase. She didn't look up. She simply glanced at the prestigious crest and said, with a dismissive wave of her hand, "Well, at least it gives you a place to do some menial work. Better than doing nothing, I suppose." Her words were a casual dismissal, reducing my life's ambition to a form of charity work. There was no party for me, no congratulations. But a few days later, my father, Colonel Bruce, told me to get in the car. He drove me 2 hours south to Washington, D.C., and we didn't go to a fancy restaurant. He took me to Ben's Chili Bowl on U Street, a place rich with history, but utterly devoid of the pretense my mother cherished. We sat on vinyl stools, the air thick with the smell of grilled onions and spice. He ordered 2 chili half-smokes, and as I took my first bite, he looked at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Don't you ever let anyone tell you your dream isn't worth celebrating, Heidi," he said, his voice low and full of a pride that felt more nourishing than any food. It was our secret alliance, a quiet rebellion, celebrated over a $5 meal. That same week, My brother Julian was accepted into a mediocre business school. My mother threw a lavish party at the Greenwich Yacht Club. I remember standing in a corner, watching her parade Julian around, her voice ringing with manufactured pride. "My Julian," she announced to anyone who would listen, "is going to build an empire." The contrast wasn't just stark, it was a carefully drawn line in the sand. Julian was an investment. I was a write-off. The memory dissolved, replaced by another, sharper and more painful. The dust of Kandahar filled my lungs. I was 29, a captain, and we had just lost a soldier, Private Miller. 19 years old, from Ohio, with a picture of his high school sweetheart taped to the inside of his helmet. An IED. One moment he was there, laughing about the Cleveland Browns, and the next, he was gone. The weight of it was a physical pressure on my chest, making it hard to breathe. That night, I managed to get a video call home, desperate for a connection to a world where things made sense. My mother's face appeared on the small pixelated screen. The first words out of her mouth were not, "Are you okay?" or "I'm so sorry." They were, "Good heavens, Heidi, you look dreadful. Are you using any moisturizer at all?" I was speechless. I had just watched a boy die, had written the letter to his parents that would shatter their world, and she was concerned about my skincare routine. Before I could find my voice, Julian pushed his face into the frame, grinning. "Hey sis, guess what? I just closed on a new Porsche, a 911 Turbo. It's a beast." I stared at their smiling, oblivious faces, from half a world away, from a world of sand and loss. They weren't just in a different time zone, they were on a different planet. A planet where a new car mattered more than a lost life. I ended the call without another word, the silence in my tent more comforting than their voices. That was the day I understood that their love was a language I would never speak, and my reality was a place they would never visit. The bitterness of that memory brought me back to the present, to the cold, quiet library of my father's house. I looked up at the portrait of Julian, his painted smile mocking me. How do you fight an enemy who doesn't even see you? An enemy who has already decided you don't matter? My father's voice, a memory as clear as day, answered me. We were camping in the Shenandoah Valley years ago. The sky was a vast, dark blanket, pricked with a million tiny lights. He pointed up. "Your mother only sees the brightest stars, Heidi," he said, his voice a gentle rumble beside me. "The CEOs, the politicians, the ones that shout their own name. But a true soldier, a true navigator, knows it's the dim stars, the ones you have to search for, that guide you when you're lost in the dark." He then told me the story of the 4 chaplains on the USS Dorchester in World War II, who gave their own life jackets to other soldiers and went down with the ship, linked arm in arm. They weren't the generals, my father said. They were the dim stars. Be a dim star, honey. Be quiet, be steady, and never, ever lose your way. Standing there in the wreckage of my mother's latest assault, his words became my only compass. The war had begun, and I was in the dark, but I remembered his lesson. I remembered the stars. But where were they now, Dad? How am I supposed to find them in this darkness? Have you ever felt that way? Like you're navigating by a map only you can see, fighting for an honor only you understand. When the people who are supposed to be your brightest stars are the ones creating the darkness, you have to learn to find the light within yourself. And I knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that it was time for me to learn how to be my own star, even if no one else could see the light. The darkness I had asked my father about arrived sooner than I expected. It came not in the form of an enemy force, but through a clipped, impersonal phone call a week after the funeral. It was from my mother's lawyer, a man whose voice was as smooth and cold as the marble in the Blackwood foyer. He informed me that the estate was undergoing comprehensive renovations, and that my personal belongings needed to be removed from my room within 48 hours. It wasn't a request, it was an eviction notice, delivered with the sterile courtesy of a corporate memo. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "Understood," and hung up. The time for fighting on that front was over. The next day, I drove back to the house in Greenwich for the last time. I packed my life into a single, olive-drab military footlocker. It wasn't much. My uniforms, a few books, my father's old chess set, and the framed photos he'd kept on his desk. Everything else in the room, the furniture, the art, the memories my mother had curated, I left behind. As I dragged the heavy trunk across the polished floor of the grand living room, I could hear my mother in the adjoining parlor, enthusiastically discussing paint swatches with an interior designer. "I'm thinking something in a dove gray, or perhaps a robin's egg blue," she was saying. She didn't even bother to look up. To her, I was already gone, just another piece of old furniture being hauled away to make room for the new. The image was stark, a 2-star general, decorated for service in 2 wars, dragging her entire life in a box out of the house she grew up in, as invisible as a ghost. I found a small 1-bedroom apartment in Alexandria, Virginia. It was anonymous, with beige walls and a view of a brick building. For the first time in my adult life, I had no mission, no schedule, no one to report to. The silence was deafening. I thought, naively, that my skills would be transferable. A general, after all, is a CEO of a very complex, high-stakes organization. I polished my resume and sent it to a few top-tier security consulting firms in the D.C. area. I got one interview. The recruiter was a young man, barely 30, with a sharp suit and an even sharper smile. He scanned my CV, his eyes widening at the medals and command positions. "This is very impressive, General," he said, his tone condescending. "But what we're really looking for are managers with specific corporate P&L experience. Your background seems to be more in general support operations." General support operations. It was my mother's phrase, helping out, dressed up in corporate jargon. He was looking at a career forged in the crucible of leadership, under fire, where decisions meant life or death. And all he saw was a lack of experience with spreadsheets. The medals on my chest, each one representing a tour, a campaign, a sacrifice, were suddenly as useless as arcade tokens. I realized then that the outside world, in its own polite way, could be just as dismissive as my own family. I was overqualified and underqualified all at the same time. That night was the longest. The apartment felt less like a home and more like a holding cell. The silence pressed in on me, filled with the ghosts of my mother's words, the recruiter's polite rejection, the crushing weight of my own perceived irrelevance. I sat on the floor of the empty living room, the city lights painting sterile patterns on the wall. I was adrift, lost. The stars my father had told me about were nowhere to be seen, blotted out by the city's glare and my own despair. And then another memory of my father surfaced, not of him as a colonel, but of him as a man. He had struggled, too, after his own retirement. I remembered finding a small worn card tucked into his wallet. On it was a prayer he had turned to when his own world felt like it was spinning out of control. I closed my eyes and the words came to me. A lifeline in the darkness. "God, I whispered into the empty room, my voice hoarse. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. I cannot change my mother. I cannot change her cruelty or my brother's indifference. I accepted it. A small, hard knot of anger in my chest seemed to loosen. The courage to change the things I can. I could change this apartment. I could change my routine. I could change myself. The power wasn't out there. It was right here. And the wisdom to know the difference. The wisdom was in knowing which battles to fight. The battle against my mother's opinion was a lost cause. But the battle for my own self-respect, that was a war I had to win. A profound sense of calm washed over me, a quiet peace I hadn't felt in years. The next morning, I was up at UWM 500. I put on my running shoes and ran 5 miles along the Potomac. When I got back, I unpacked the footlocker. I didn't just put things away. I arranged them with military precision. My father's books on one shelf, my uniforms hung perfectly in the closet. I was taking back control, one small disciplined action at a time. I was building a new fortress, my fortress. Just as I finished, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I didn't recognize the number. It just said, "Unknown caller." For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something, a flicker of instinct, told me to answer. "Hello," I said, my voice steady. A pause, and then a woman's voice, hesitant but clear. "General Bruce, this is Captain Kaylin Vance. We need to talk." Kaylin Vance. The name registered, but the context felt wrong. She was my brother's fiancée, a part of their world of yacht clubs and charity galas. My first instinct was caution. This could be another move in my mother's game. A different kind of attack cloaked in concern. I agreed to meet her, but on my own terms. I chose a small, quiet cafe near the Women in Military Service for America Memorial, a place of silent, steadfast honor that felt like a sanctuary. I arrived first, selecting a table in the corner that gave me a clear view of the entrance. It was an old habit, assessing a new environment for threats. When Captain Vance walked in, she was in her Air Force service dress, the blue uniform crisp and immaculate. She spotted me, and her shoulders, which had been tense, seemed to square themselves with resolve. She walked to my table, her posture perfect. She didn't offer to shake my hand. She simply stood at attention for a brief moment before taking a seat. "General Bruce," she said, her voice clear but carrying an undercurrent of tension. "Thank you for meeting me." She didn't order a drink. She just sat there, her back straight, her hands placed neatly on the table in front of her. The formal military bearing was so out of place in the relaxed coffee shop, and yet it was a language I understood better than any social pleasantry. I waited, my own posture reflecting a practiced neutrality. "Ma'am, I was at the reception after the funeral," she began, her eyes fixed on a point just past my shoulder. "I was standing near the library. I saw and I heard what your mother did, what she said." She finally met my gaze, and her eyes were filled with a fiery indignation that took me by surprise. And I cannot, in good conscience, remain silent. She took a breath, and the story came tumbling out, her voice trembling slightly with the memory. "Ma'am, Julian and your mother, they only know you through parties and press clippings. I know you from the smell of smoke and the sound of rotor blades." Her words transported me back a decade to the Korangal Valley in Afghanistan, the Valley of Death. I could almost feel the grit of the sand in my teeth. "My helicopter had been hit by an RPG," she said, her voice barely a whisper now. "We were pinned down, a reconnaissance team of 12, completely surrounded. Command's assessment was that we were a lost cause. The risk of a rescue operation was too high. They were going to write us off. She paused, swallowing hard. But you were in the command tent. You heard the call. You overruled them. You saw a strategic possibility where they only saw a loss. You put together a quick reaction force and led the charge yourself. The memory was a blur of controlled chaos, of shouting orders over the deafening roar of gunfire, of the taste of copper in my mouth. Your mother called you a helper, Kaylin said, and now there were tears welling in her eyes, tears of anger, not sadness. But to me, and to the 11 other souls you pulled out of that valley that day, ma'am, you were God. The word hung in the air between us, raw and powerful. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was a validation so pure, so absolute, it felt like a physical force. All the years of being diminished, of being called an embarrassment, of being made to feel like my life's work was a triviality. It was all incinerated in the heat of her testimony. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. A warmth spread through my chest, a feeling I hadn't known was possible anymore. She pushed a small single key across the table. It was plain, unadorned. "This is a spare key to my apartment in Arlington," she said, her voice regaining its military firmness. "It's a secure building. If you ever need a safe place, a tactical retreat, consider it your forward operating base. I am your soldier, General, on any battlefield. And that includes this one." I looked at the young captain, at the unwavering loyalty in her eyes, and I understood what my father meant. This was a dim star, a steady light in the overwhelming darkness. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. I felt that I wasn't entirely alone in this war. We sat in a comfortable silence for a few minutes, two soldiers who understood each other without needing more words. A fragile peace settled over our small table, and then the bell above the cafe door chimed, and the peace was shattered. Julian stood there, his expensive suit looking out of place, his face a mask of annoyance. He didn't even glance at Kaylin. His eyes, cold and dismissive, were locked on me. He walked towards our table, his footsteps loud in the suddenly quiet cafe. "Kaylin," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, as he finally acknowledged his fiancée, though his glare remained fixed on me. "What are you doing here, with her?" He spat the last word out, as if it were a piece of trash in his mouth. The air crackled with a new, immediate tension. The warmth in my chest vanished, replaced by the familiar, cold steel of a defensive perimeter. The brief ceasefire was over. The enemy was at the gate. A few days after my meeting with Kaylin, the enemy launched a frontal assault. They didn't use military tactics. They used a weapon far more insidious, the pretense of family. They appeared at the door of my small Alexandria apartment unannounced, my mother, Serafina, and my brother, Julian. My hand instinctively tightened on the doorknob, my entire body tensing for a confrontation. But Serafina was a master of her own brand of warfare. She didn't come with anger. She came with a performance worthy of an Oscar. Her eyes were artfully shadowed with sorrow. She held out a lavish gift basket from Dean and DeLuca, an offering of peace that felt more like a bribe. "Heidi, darling," she began, her voice a soft, trembling whisper. She reached out and gave me a brief, stiff hug that had no warmth at all. "I am so sorry. I haven't been myself since your father. I've been grieving." She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "We're family, Heidi. We have to protect each other, now more than ever." I remained silent, my internal threat assessment running at high alert. This was a classic love-bombing campaign. a textbook maneuver to lower my defenses. Julian stepped forward, his expression a careful blend of enthusiasm and fraternal concern. "Mom's right, sis," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "And I have some good news, a chance to restore the family name, to build on what Dad started." He spoke of a massive government contract, a deal that would secure the Blackwood legacy for generations. His words were grand and vague, designed to appeal to a sense of duty I no longer felt towards them. The entire performance was so sickeningly sweet, so transparently false, that a cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. I knew the real demand was coming. Julian, ever the smooth operator, got to the point. He placed a thick, leather-bound portfolio on my small kitchen table. The expensive accessory looked absurdly out of place in my Spartan apartment. "It's a major defense subcontract," he explained, flipping it open to a signature page. "But there's a hitch. The prime contractor requires a board member with an active top-secret SCI clearance to act as a guarantor. It's just a formality, of course." My blood ran cold. Top-secret, sensitive, compartmented information clearance. It wasn't just a security level, it was the highest declaration of trust the United States government could bestow upon a citizen. It was a symbol of my entire career, of my unwavering integrity, and he was calling it a formality. He leaned in, a conspiratorial gleam in his eye. "You just sign here as an honorary board member. We put your name on the letterhead, and that's it. It's a win-win." He then added the final fatal insult, a smirk playing on his lips. "Look, even if you are just helping out at your unit, that general's star on your shoulder still has value to us." There it was, the poisoned offering laid bare. They didn't respect me. They didn't value my service. They saw my honor, my life's work, as nothing more than a commodity, a tool to be used for their own greedy ends. I picked up the document, my eyes scanning the fine print. My training in reading intelligence briefs kicked in. I saw the red flags immediately. A shell corporation in Delaware, vaguely worded liability clauses, the name of a defense contractor notorious for cutting corners. This wasn't a contract, it was a trap. They weren't asking me to be a guarantor. They were asking me to be the fall guy. They were asking me to sign away my honor, my freedom, and the very legacy of the father they claimed to be protecting. That was the final straw, the last fragile thread of hope for any semblance of family, of decency, snapped. A cold, hard fury, pure and absolute, rose within me. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of a family argument. It was the focused, precise anger of a commander whose core principles have been violated. I placed the portfolio back on the table and looked up, meeting my brother's expectant gaze, then my mother's pleading one. My face was a blank slate. My voice, when I spoke, was devoid of all emotion. It was as cold and hard as steel. No. The word, quiet but absolute, hung in the air. Seraphina's practiced sad expression faltered. "What did you say?" she stammered. "Heidi, this is for the family." I stood up, my 5'7" frame suddenly feeling much taller. I looked directly at her, then at Julian, no longer as a daughter or a sister, but as a superior officer addressing insubordinate personnel. "I said no," I repeated, my voice clear and unwavering. "I spent 25 years building my honor. I will not have it dismantled in 5 minutes for the sake of your greed." I picked up the portfolio and held it out to Julian. "Take your proposal and leave my home." Their faces shifted from feigned concern to unveiled rage. The masks were off. "You ungrateful," my mother began, but I cut her off with a look. "Now," I said. The single word was a command, not a request. They snatched the portfolio and stormed out, slamming the door behind them, leaving a trail of muttered curses in their wake. I stood alone in the silence, my heart pounding, not with fear, but with the adrenaline of a battle finally joined. The line had been drawn. They had shown me their final move. Now it was my turn. I walked to my phone, my fingers steady as I scrolled through my contacts to a name I hadn't called in years, a name saved under the codename Minerva. I pressed the call button. He answered on the second ring. "Eris," I said, my voice calm and resolute. "It's Heidi Bruce. We need to talk immediately." Eris Thorne lived in a historic brownstone in Georgetown, a quiet street that belied the world of secrets it likely harbored. When he opened the door, he looked exactly as I remembered him from my father's Christmas parties: salt and pepper hair, a crisply ironed shirt, and eyes like a hawk's, sharp and missing nothing. He was my father's best friend, a legend from the Defense Intelligence Agency. He didn't offer a hug or empty platitudes. He simply nodded and said, "Heidi, get in here." He led me to a study lined with books on history and military strategy. He poured 2 cups of black tea, the movements precise and economical. I recounted the events of the past few weeks, from the funeral to the poisoned contract offer. My voice was steady, delivering the facts like a field report. I stripped away the emotion, presenting only the tactical reality of the situation. Aris listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving my face. When I finished, he took a slow sip of his tea. He didn't say, "I'm so sorry for what you're going through." He didn't say, "Your mother has always been difficult." He looked at me, his eyes glinting with a familiar, strategic fire, and delivered the most validating assessment I had ever heard. "Your mother isn't just attacking you emotionally, Heidi," he stated, his voice calm and analytical. "She is conducting a systematic information warfare campaign designed to erase your identity and seize control of your father's legacy." He set his cup down. "We will mount a proportional response." Those words were like a key turning in a lock I didn't know was rusted shut. He didn't see a grieving daughter. He saw a strategic threat, an operation. He gave my pain a name, a framework, and in doing so, he gave me back my power. I wasn't just a victim, I was a target in a definable conflict. And I knew how to operate in a conflict. "Follow me," he said, rising. He led me through a door, disguised as a bookshelf, into a room that took my breath away. It was a private situation room. One wall was covered by a massive whiteboard. Another held a series of monitors, currently dark. The room was soundproofed, secure. This was Eris's true office. He picked up a dry erase marker. "Let's map the battle space," he said. On the board, he drew a diagram. At the top, he wrote, "Seraphina Blackwood, Center of Gravity." Underneath, "Julian Blackwood, Primary Actor." He drew lines connecting them to their sources of power: Blackwood Family Trust, Wall Street Connections, Social Influence, Greenwich, NYC. He circled their weaknesses: arrogance, dependence on public image, potential financial irregularities. I walked up to the board, took a different colored marker, and added a new box, capped Kaylin Vance, asset in place. Eris looked at it and gave a curt nod of approval. "Good. Who else?" We worked for an hour, my personal anguish transforming into a cold, hard operational plan. The rage that had been simmering inside me was now being channeled into objectives and timelines. Finally, Eris stepped back from the board. "Our objective is not revenge," he said, his tone that of a commander briefing his staff. "Revenge is messy and emotional. Our objective is threat neutralization. We will dismantle their operation by exposing the truth, thereby securing Sterling's legacy and re-establishing your identity. This is a campaign, Heidi, not a family feud. You need to treat it as such. The clarity was exhilarating. He was speaking my language. He saw me not as a broken woman, but as the general I was trained to be. He trusted my capabilities. He then walked to a locked cabinet and opened it. He took out 2 small black objects. He placed one in my hand. It was a digital audio recorder, no bigger than a button on my coat. The other was a heavily encrypted USB flash drive. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, he said, a rare glint of humor in his eyes, is to gather intelligence, record everything, every phone call, every conversation. Julian is arrogant. He will overplay his hand and try to contact you again. Captain Vance is our asset inside their perimeter. She will provide what she can. We are building a case file. He tapped the whiteboard with his marker. A dossier, your dossier, the truth. I closed my hand around the cool metal of the devices. The weight was insignificant, but it felt as substantial as a rifle. A sense of purpose, clean and sharp, flooded through me. The fog of grief and confusion had lifted. I was no longer lost in the dark. I had been given a mission. I had a commander, and I had a plan. The war had just been given its strategy. The following days were a blur of cold, calculated action. My small apartment transformed into a clandestine command post. The campaign to build the dossier had begun. Eris was right. My brother's arrogance was his greatest vulnerability. 2 days after their disastrous visit, Julian called. His tone had shifted from feigned concern to impatient bullying. With the button-sized recorder Eris had given me active in my pocket, I listened as he alternately threatened me with being cut off from the family forever and tempted me with a share of the profits. Every word was a nail in his own coffin, captured in pristine digital audio. Intel acquired. Uploaded to secure drive. Our asset in place, Captain Kaylin Vance, proved to be as courageous in this new kind of warfare as she was on the battlefield. Under the guise of planning her wedding to Julian, she gained access to his home office. One evening, while he was on a conference call, she executed a swift, silent operation. She copied the contents of his laptop's hard drive onto the encrypted USB Eris had provided. The risk was immense. If she had been caught, the consequences would have been catastrophic. But her nerve held. Data secured. Awaiting analysis. The files were a goldmine. Emails between Julian and my mother laid out their plan in sickening detail. A systematic effort to marginalize me and consolidate their control over my father's estate long before he had even passed. They discussed lawyers, offshore accounts, and strategies to have me declared mentally unfit to manage my own affairs if I resisted. It was worse than I had imagined. It wasn't just greed, it was a premeditated character assassination. One quiet evening, after reviewing the latest intelligence packet, a wave of exhaustion hit me. I felt the need to connect with something real, something of my father's that wasn't tainted by this conflict. I pulled his old military footlocker from the closet. As I sorted through his belongings, his dress uniforms, his books on military history, his collection of presidential biographies, my fingers brushed against a loose board at the bottom. Curious, I pried it up. Beneath it lay a false compartment, and inside, nestled in the dark space, were 2 items, a worn leather-bound journal and a thick manila envelope sealed with wax. My heart hammered against my ribs. I opened the journal. It was my father's handwriting, familiar and steady. It wasn't a log of his military career, but a private diary, started in the years after I had left for West Point. I read, and the world fell away. He wrote of his pride, a pride he felt he couldn't express openly in Seraphina's presence. He wrote of his arguments with her, of her disdain for my chosen path. One entry, dated a decade ago, stood out. "Seraphina doesn't understand," he wrote. "She sees Heidi's service as a rejection of our world, of the Blackwood name. She cannot comprehend that honor is not something you buy at a charity auction. Heidi's honor is forged in fire. I worry for her. I worry what they will do when I am no longer here to stand between them." Reading those words, a dam inside me broke. A sob, raw and ragged, escaped my lips. It was the first time I had cried since he died. These weren't just words on a page. They were the validation I had spent my entire life starving for. The silent witness to my struggle. He had seen, he had known, he had worried for me. The grief was immense, but tangled within it was a profound, aching gratitude. With trembling hands, I picked up the sealed envelope. My name, Heidi Ann Bruce, was written on the front in his strong, cursive script. I broke the wax seal. Inside was a legal document, a codicil to his will, dated and notarized just 6 months before his death. I read the legal jargon, my mind racing to comprehend its full import. In clear, unambiguous terms, my father stipulated that, in the event of his passing, his entire personal estate, separate from the assets shared with my mother, was to be placed into a private trust. This included his investment portfolio, his savings, and, most critically, the deed to the Greenwich house, which had been his family's property long before he had ever met Seraphina Blackwood, and the sole trustee, with absolute and final authority over this trust, me. He had foreseen their greed. He had anticipated their campaign to disinherit me, and from beyond the grave, he had built a final line of defense. This wasn't just a legal document. It was a shield. It was a weapon. It was the last loving, protective act of a father who understood the war his daughter would have to fight. I held the paper in my hand, feeling its weight. The dossier we were building was strong. It had emails, financial records, and recorded conversations. It was a case built on their lies and deceit. But this was different. This was the truth, codified and weaponized. This was the secret weapon my father had left me. The board in Eris's Situation Room flashed in my mind. The entire strategic landscape had just changed. This wasn't just a counteroffensive anymore. This was checkmate. The annual Blackwood Foundation Charity Gala, held in the Egyptian wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was the crown jewel of my mother's social empire. It was a dazzling display of power and influence, where New York's elite gathered to write checks and affirm their own benevolence under the watchful eyes of ancient pharaohs. This was her throne room, her ultimate stage. And tonight, we were going to burn it to the ground. I walked in, flanked by Eris Thorne and my lawyer, Mr. Davies. I was not in my uniform. I wore a simple, elegant black dress, tailored with military precision. It was my own kind of armor. My presence sent a ripple of whispers through the crowd. I was the ghost at the feast, the disgraced daughter who was supposed to have faded into obscurity. I ignored the stairs, my focus locked on the podium at the far end of the hall. Seraphina was in her element, gliding through the room, a queen accepting tribute from her court. When the time came, she ascended the stage, bathed in a warm spotlight. She spoke eloquently about legacy, about philanthropy, about the importance of family. From my vantage point, I could see Julian and Kaylin standing just off stage. Julian looked smug, the air apparent. Kaylin looked pale, her hands clenched at her sides. My mother raised her champagne flute. "To the enduring legacy of the Blackwood and Bruce families," she declared. That was our cue. Our! As if on a silent command, Kaylin Vance stepped away from Julian's side. She walked to the edge of the stage, her Air Force uniform a stark slash of blue against the opulent backdrop. A technician, one of Eris's contacts, quietly handed her a wireless microphone. She walked down the steps and directly towards me. The room fell silent, a confused hush descending upon the crowd. She stopped 2 feet in front of me. In the dead silence of the Temple of Dendur, she brought her heels together and executed a salute so sharp, so perfect, it seemed to cut the air. Her voice, amplified by the microphone, rang out clear and strong, filled with an unwavering respect that defied every lie my mother had ever told. "Major General Bruce," she said, "it is an honor." A collective gasp swept through the hall. Before anyone could process what was happening, Phase 2 commenced. The massive screen behind my mother, which had been displaying the Foundation's logo, flickered and changed. The dossier, our dossier, came to life. First, the emails. Scanned copies of the correspondence between Julian and Serafina, their plot to disinherit me laid bare in their own words. Then, the audio. Julian's voice filled the cavernous hall, laced with threats and condescension. "Even if you are just helping out, that general's star on your shoulder still has value to us." The raw, naked greed in his voice was undeniable. The whispers in the crowd grew into a roar of shock and outrage. I watched my mother's face. Her smile froze, then crumbled. Her face went slack, the color draining from it until it was as white as the tablecloths. The mask of the gracious matriarch shattered, revealing the panicked, ugly truth beneath. Then Mr. Davies, my lawyer, calmly walked onto the stage. He took the main microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "In light of these revelations, I have a legal announcement to make. On behalf of my client, General Heidi Bruce." He held up a document. "This is a legally binding codicil to the last will and testament of Colonel Sterling Bruce. It stipulates that his entire personal estate, including the deed to the Greenwich property, is to be transferred immediately into a private trust." He paused for dramatic effect. "The sole trustee of this fund with absolute and final authority is his daughter, Major General Heidi Bruce." The dam broke. The hall exploded in a maelstrom of noise. Serafina staggered back, her hand flying to her throat as if she couldn't breathe. Julian, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, tried to slip away. But a swarm of journalists, alerted by a timely tip from Eris, descended upon him. Their camera flashes like lightning strikes. In the midst of the chaos, I walked up the steps and onto the stage. I gently took the microphone from my mother's limp, unresisting hand. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. I faced the hundreds of shocked faces, the pillars of New York society, who had borne witness to my public execution. My voice was calm, clear, and carried the weight of a lifetime of command. "Honor," I said, "is not something you inherit in a will or purchase at an auction. It is something you build, day by day, with your actions." I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the room. My father's true legacy was not his portfolio. It was his service, his integrity, his honor. I looked toward the back of the room where Eris stood, giving me a nearly imperceptible nod. "And tonight," I finished, "that legacy has been secured." I placed the microphone carefully on the podium. I did not run. I did not gloat. I simply turned, walked down the steps, and strode out of the hall, leaving the smoldering ruins of my mother's empire behind me. The battle was over. Victory is not always a triumphant parade. Sometimes it's just the quiet that follows a long and brutal war. The morning after the gala, the news of the Blackwood family's public implosion was everywhere. Splashed across the New York Post, dissected on morning news shows. I had expected to feel a sense of elation, of vindication. Instead, I just felt empty. It was the bone-deep exhaustion of a soldier after a grueling campaign, when the adrenaline has faded and all that's left is the silence. My phone became a front line of its own. It buzzed incessantly, with a barrage of text messages from Julian, each one more vitriolic than the last. They were a stream of pure, undiluted rage, blaming me for ruining his life, for destroying the family, for being a selfish, ungrateful monster. He took no responsibility. In his world, he was the victim. From my mother, there was only silence. A cold, damning silence that was somehow louder than Julian's rants. I didn't reply. I turned the phone off and placed it in a drawer. I spent the entire day in my small apartment, just sitting in a chair by the window, watching the world go on without me. I wasn't celebrating a victory. I was mourning a loss. Not the loss of my mother or brother as they were, but the loss of the idea of them. I was grieving for the family I had always wished for, the one that had never really existed outside of my own desperate hope. The final definitive death of that illusion left a hollow space inside me, and I knew it was a space that needed to be felt, not filled. A few weeks later, Eris sent me a book. It was Daring Greatly by Brené Brown. A required reading for all modern warriors, his note said. I started reading about vulnerability, courage, and the power of owning your own story. It was a different kind of battlefield manual, one that taught you how to navigate the terrain of your own heart. It was while I was reading that book that the knock came. I opened the door to find my mother standing there. The Serafina Blackwood, who had reigned over New York society, was gone. In her place was a diminished woman, her expensive clothes looking ill-fitting on her now stooped frame. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate panic. She began to cry, messy, theatrical sobs. "Heidi, please," she begged, her hands twisting the strap of her designer handbag. "You have to forgive me. Call it off. Tell the lawyers to stop." She looked around my small apartment with disdain, even in her desperation. "They're going to take the house, my home. I have nowhere else to go." I looked at my mother, the woman who had caused me a lifetime of pain, and I felt nothing. The anger was gone. The hurt was a distant echo. All that remained was a profound, weary pity. I saw a small, frightened woman who had built her entire identity on a foundation of money and lies, and now that it was crumbling, she had nothing left. I spoke, and my voice was calm, not with the coldness of a soldier, but with the quiet strength of someone who had finally found her peace. "I forgive you, Mother." A flicker of triumph lit her eyes. "You do?" "Yes," I said. "I forgive you for not being the mother I needed." But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean erasing what was done. I took a small, steadying breath. I cannot let you back into my life. The boundary is permanent. I gently closed the door, the soft click of the latch echoing in the hallway. It was the hardest, most necessary act of self-preservation I had ever performed. I leaned against the door, the wood cool against my back, and for the first time I felt the true meaning of freedom. It wasn't about winning. It was about no longer having to fight. The next day, I met with Mr. Davies. With the legal authority granted by my father's codicil, I gave him his new instructions. We weren't going to sell the house. We weren't going to evict my mother. We were going to establish a new entity, the Colonel Sterling Bruce Legacy Foundation. Its mission would be to provide college scholarships for the children of fallen and wounded service members. Its funding would come entirely from the assets in my father's trust. Mr. Davies drew up the legal framework. Serafina would be allowed to remain in the Greenwich house as a tenant, but she would be required to pay fair market rent each month, a check written not to me, but directly to the foundation. In a final, beautiful irony, the woman who had spent her life despising the values of military service would now spend the rest of her days unwittingly funding the futures of the very families who embodied it. Her rent checks would become a symbol of her defeat, a monthly tribute to the honor she could never understand. It wasn't revenge, it was justice, and it was a new beginning. A year passed. My new life didn't have the high-stakes tension of a war zone or the opulent drama of a Greenwich estate. It was quiet, it was steady, and it was mine. The headquarters for the Colonel Sterling Bruce Legacy Foundation wasn't a gleaming office tower, but a modest, rented space in Alexandria, with good natural light and the constant, pleasant aroma of brewing coffee. My desk was no longer cluttered with strategic assessments and troop movement reports. Instead, it was covered in something far more important: letters. They were handwritten letters, mostly in the careful, earnest script of teenagers. Some were decorated with crayon drawings or stickers. They were from the first class of scholarship recipients, the sons and daughters of soldiers who had made the ultimate sacrifice, or who had come home wounded in body or spirit. I read every single one. A young man from Texas, whose father was a wounded warrior, was now studying engineering at Texas A&M. A young woman from California, whose mother died in a helicopter crash in Iraq, was in her first year of nursing school. One letter, written on lined notebook paper, made me pause. It was from a girl in rural Pennsylvania. "Dear General Bruce," it read, "my mom said to tell you that because of this scholarship, I'm the first person in our family to go to college. She says my dad would be so proud watching from heaven." I traced the young girl's handwriting with my finger. These letters, these small testaments to renewed hope, were the most profound medals I had ever earned. They were the tangible proof that my father's legacy, a legacy of service, was alive and growing. My new family was forged in this quiet mission. Eris and Kaylin were frequent visitors. Kaylin had broken off her engagement with Julian shortly after the gala. She was now stationed at the Pentagon, and we would often meet for lunch, our conversations easy and filled with the shared understanding of our world. Eris, my mentor, would stop by with books and strategic advice, not for warfare, but for navigating the complexities of running a non-profit. They were my family now, a family chosen not by blood, but by shared values and mutual respect. One spring afternoon, a formal invitation arrived. It was from the United States Military Academy. They were asking me to be a guest lecturer for the senior cadets, to speak about leadership and ethics. They wanted me to come back to West Point, the place where my journey had begun. Standing on the stage of the auditorium, looking out at the sea of crisp gray uniforms, was a surreal experience. I was no longer the frightened, determined young cadet I had once been. I was a general, a veteran of foreign wars, and a survivor of a domestic one. I looked at their faces, so young, so full of conviction and a belief in the clear lines between right and wrong. I knew I had to tell them the truth about the most difficult battlefield they would ever face. The most courageous act a soldier can perform, I began, my voice echoing slightly in the vast hall, is not always facing enemy fire. Sometimes it is speaking the truth to those who are supposed to love you. It's holding the line when that line is inside your own home. I let the words sink in. Your honor is not in the rank on your shoulder or the ribbons on your chest. Those are recognitions of service. Your true, unassailable honor is a fortress inside you. It is the one piece of ground that no enemy can ever take. Unless you open the gates for them, guard that fortress, guard it with your life, because it is your life. I didn't speak of tactics or strategy. I spoke of the war within, the war for one's own soul. Later that evening, as dusk settled over the Hudson Valley, I walked alone across the plain at West Point. The sky was a deep, velvety blue, and the first stars of the evening were beginning to appear. I thought of my father, and for the first time, the memory brought no ache, only a quiet, profound peace. I was no longer searching for his stars in the darkness. I had learned to navigate by my own. I had become my father's dim star, quiet and steady. I hadn't built an empire like Julian had dreamed of, or commanded the social stage like my mother. My legacy wasn't written in stock prices or headlines. It was written in the futures of those kids, in the letters on my desk, in the quiet integrity of a life reclaimed. It was a smaller light, perhaps, but it was a true one. And I knew with a certainty that filled my entire being that it was strong enough to guide others home. I looked up at the twilight sky and smiled. It was not a smile of victory or of vindication. It was a smile of freedom, pure and simple. My story has ended, but perhaps yours is just beginning. I learned that my honor was a fortress, and I had to be its staunchest defender. What is the fortress inside of you that needs defending? Know that you are not alone in your battle. There are countless dim stars out there, steady and true, who understand. If my story resonated with you, please subscribe to Channel Name. Here we share true stories that remind us of our own strength and the quiet courage it takes to reclaim our lives. You are seen, you are heard.